The desert wind carried the sound of distant gunfire as Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hoth Rodriguez adjusted his night vision goggles and surveyed the compound below. 3 days of reconnaissance had led his 8-man SEAL team to this moment, a high-stakes hostage rescue operation in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. The intelligence was solid. 12 American aid workers held captive by a splinter terrorist cell that had broken away from the Taliban's mainstream operations. Rodriguez had been leading special operations for over a decade, but something about this mission felt different. The satellite imagery showed unusual movement patterns around the compound, and the intercepted communications suggested the hostages weren't being held in the typical basement or reinforced room. Instead, they appeared to be scattered throughout a multi-building complex that looked more like a family compound than a terrorist stronghold. Petty Officer Jake Viper Morrison crouched beside his team leader, studying the target through his scope. At 28, Morrison was one of the youngest operators on the team, but his marksmanship skills had earned him respect among the veteran SEALs. "Boss, something's not adding up," he whispered into his throat mic. "The thermal signatures show way more people than we expected. Looks like there might be 30 or 40 individuals down there." Chief Petty Officer Sam Ghost Williams, the team's intelligence specialist, pulled up the latest satellite feed on his tablet. Williams had served 3 combat deployments and had an uncanny ability to read situations that others missed. The latest intercepts suggest they've been moving the hostages every few hours. Could be a shell game to keep us guessing about their exact location. The mission briefing had been clear but complex. The 12 hostages were members of a medical aid organization that had been providing health care to remote Afghan villages when their convoy was ambushed 6 days earlier. The attackers, led by a former Taliban commander named Khalil Haqqani, had demanded the release of 50 prisoners from Guantanamo Bay and a ransom of $10 million. The deadline was set for sunrise less than 4 hours away. Rodriguez studied the compound through his binoculars, noting the defensive positions and guard rotations they had observed over the past 72 hours. The main building was a traditional Afghan compound with high walls and multiple courtyards. 2 smaller structures flanked the main house, connected by covered walkways that would provide concealment for the assault team's approach. "Delta, this is Alpha 1. Rodriguez spoke quietly into his radio, communicating with the Overwatch team positioned on the ridge above. "We're seeing movement in the northeast courtyard." "Can you confirm?" Staff Sergeant Mike Razor Thompson's voice crackled through the comm system. Thompson was positioned with a Barrett .50 caliber rifle, providing long-range support for the team. "Alpha 1, I've got eyes on 2 guards near the main entrance. They're armed with AK-47s and appear to be on a regular patrol pattern. No sign of the hostages from my position." The intelligence package had identified Khalil Haqqani as a former Taliban sub-commander who had grown disillusioned with the group's cooperation with international forces. After breaking away 18 months earlier, he had formed his own cell focused on high-profile kidnappings and attacks against Western aid workers. His group was smaller but more unpredictable than traditional Taliban units, making them particularly dangerous. Petty Officer First Class Tony Shark Martinez, the team's demolitions expert, was studying the compound's structural weaknesses through his scope. Martinez had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador as a child and had joined the Navy to serve his adopted country. His expertise with explosives had saved countless lives during urban combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. "I can see at least 3 entry points," Martinez reported. "The main gate is reinforced, but there's a weakness in the eastern wall where recent construction looks incomplete. We could breach there with minimal noise if needed." The team had been inserted by helicopter 12 kilometers from the target, hiking through treacherous mountain terrain under cover of darkness. Each operator carried specialized equipment for the mission: suppressed weapons, night vision systems, communications gear, medical supplies, and enough ammunition for a sustained firefight if the rescue turned into a running battle. Rodriguez reviewed the mission timeline once more. Intelligence suggested the hostages were being held in different locations within the compound to prevent a single rescue attempt from freeing all of them. The plan called for simultaneous entry through multiple breach points, with teams moving to secure the hostages while maintaining communication and mutual support. "Listen up." Rodriguez addressed his team through the tactical radio network. "Remember, Our primary objective is getting those 12 Americans out alive. We go in fast, we go in quiet, and we adapt to whatever we find down there. Rules of engagement are clear. Positive identification before engaging. And watch your backgrounds. These terrorists have shown they're willing to use hostages as human shields. The compound had been under surveillance by unmanned drones for the past week, providing the SEALs with detailed information about guard rotations, defensive positions, and daily routines. The analysis showed that the terrorist cell consisted of approximately 20 fighters, armed primarily with small arms and improvised explosive devices. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Frost Chen, the team's medic and communications specialist, ran final checks on the encrypted radio systems that would keep the team connected during the assault. Chen had served tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan, treating wounded civilians and soldiers under fire. His calm demeanor under pressure made him invaluable during high-stress operations. "Comms check all stations," Chen transmitted. "Alpha 1, Alpha 2, Delta, and Eagle Eye respond for final systems check." Each team member confirmed their communications were functioning properly. Eagle Eye was the drone operator controlling an MQ-9 Reaper circling high above the target area, providing real-time intelligence and potential close air support if the situation deteriorated. The meteorological conditions were nearly perfect for a night assault. The moon was in its new phase, providing maximum darkness, and the wind was light and variable, which would help mask the sounds of their approach. Temperature was holding steady at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to reduce thermal signatures but not so cold as to affect equipment performance. Rodriguez studied the most recent intelligence photographs, memorizing the layout of buildings, defensive positions, and potential escape routes. The compound was situated in a narrow valley with steep walls on 3 sides, which would limit the terrorists' ability to flee, but also restrict the SEALs' own escape routes if the mission went sideways. The hostages had been identified through intercepted communications and surveillance footage. They included Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a cardiac surgeon from Denver, who had been leading the medical mission. Dr. Sally Mitchell. James Park, an infectious disease specialist from Johns Hopkins. 6 nurses from various American hospitals, and 3 logistics coordinators who manage the aid organization's supply chain in the region. Intelligence reports suggested that Dr. Mitchell had been singled out by the terrorists, possibly because of her medical expertise or leadership role within the group. Intercepted communications indicated she had been questioned extensively about American military medical procedures, suggesting the terrorists might be planning to use her knowledge for future attacks against U.S. forces. Alpha 1, this is Eagle Eye, came the voice of the drone operator. "I'm showing increased activity around the main building. Looks like they're moving people between structures. Could be relocating the hostages again." Rodriguez felt the familiar tension that preceded combat operations. Every mission carried risks, but hostage rescues were particularly challenging because the enemy held all the advantages of position, preparation, and human shields. The SEALs would need to rely on speed, surprise, and superior training to overcome those disadvantages. The team began their final approach, moving in tactical formation down the rocky slope toward the compound. Each operator carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, body armor, communications gear, medical supplies, and specialized tools for breaching doors and walls. Morrison took point, using his night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain while watching for sentries or early warning systems. The terrorists had proven to be more sophisticated than initially assessed, with evidence of improvised explosive devices and coordinated defensive preparations. Movement. 10 o'clock. Morrison whispered into his throat mic. "Single individual, appears to be armed, moving along the perimeter wall." The team froze, taking cover behind large boulders and scrub brush while Rodriguez assessed the threat. Through his night vision scope, he could see a guard walking a patrol route along the outside of the compound walls. The man carried an AK-47 and wore traditional Afghan clothing, making him blend naturally with the local environment. Williams, monitoring intercepted radio communications, heard increased chatter among the defenders. "They're talking about changing the guard rotation early. Sounds like they might be getting nervous about something." The intelligence picture was becoming more complex as the team approached the target. Instead of the straightforward rescue scenario they had planned for, the SEALs were discovering that their enemy was more organized, better armed, and more paranoid than initial assessments had suggested. Rodriguez made the tactical decision to hold position while gathering additional intelligence. Rushing into an unknown situation could result in casualties among both the rescue team and the hostages they were trying to save. All stations, this is Alpha 1. We're holding current position for additional reconnaissance. Eagle Eye, I need updated thermal imagery of the target area. Delta, maintain overwatch and report any changes in guard positions. The drone operator adjusted his sensors, providing enhanced thermal imaging that revealed the locations of individuals throughout the compound. The images showed clusters of people in 3 different buildings, with guards positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. Alpha 1, Eagle Eye. I'm counting approximately 30 heat signatures spread across the compound. The largest group appears to be in the main building, with smaller groups in the 2 secondary structures. Can't determine which signatures are hostages versus guards from this altitude. Chen was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, listening for any communications that might provide clues about the hostages' exact locations or the terrorists' plans. The intercepted conversations were primarily in Pashto and Dari, languages he had studied intensively during his deployments in Afghanistan. I'm hearing references to the American doctor being moved to a different location, Chen reported. Sounds like they're particularly concerned about her security. The team's rules of engagement were clear, but challenging to implement in a complex hostage situation. They were authorized to use lethal force to protect the hostages and themselves, but they needed positive identification of targets and had to minimize risk to civilian captives. Martinez studied the compound's defensive preparations through his scope, noting improvised barriers, fighting positions, and what appeared to be explosive devices positioned at key choke points. Boss, they've definitely been preparing for an assault. I can see wire obstacles and what looks like IED emplacements along the main approach routes. These guys are more professional than we initially thought. The realization that they were facing a more sophisticated enemy force required Rodriguez to reassess the mission plan. The original concept called for a rapid assault with minimal resistance, but the evidence suggested they would face organized opposition from well-prepared defenders. Thompson, maintaining his overwatch position, reported movement in the surrounding hills. Alpha 1, Delta. I'm seeing movement on the ridgeline to our north. Could be additional sentries or a security patrol. Range is approximately 800 meters. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex as the SEALs gathered more intelligence about their target. What had been planned as a straightforward rescue operation was evolving into a more challenging scenario that would require all of their training, experience, and adaptability to complete successfully. Rodriguez knew that time was running out. The terrorists' deadline was approaching, and intelligence suggested they were serious about harming the hostages if their demands weren't met. The SEAL team represented the best and possibly only chance of getting the 12 Americans out alive. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying with it the sounds and smells of a foreign land where American forces had been fighting for nearly 2 decades. For Rodriguez and his team, this mission represented everything they had trained for. The opportunity to bring fellow Americans home safely from a situation where diplomacy and negotiation had failed. As they prepared to move closer to the compound, each SEAL understood that the next few hours would test every aspect of their training, courage, and commitment to the warrior's creed of leaving no one behind. The breach point on the eastern wall looked exactly as Martinez had described, a section of newer construction that hadn't been properly reinforced. Rodriguez studied the gap through his night vision, calculating angles of approach and potential fields of fire once they were inside the compound. Alpha 2 moved to secondary position. Rodriguez commanded quietly. Petty Officer Williams led Morrison and Chen in a flanking movement that would give them access to the northern section of the compound where thermal imaging suggested the largest group of hostages was being held. The intelligence picture had continued to evolve during their approach. Eagle Eye reported that the heat signatures were moving more frequently now, suggesting increased activity inside the compound. Either the terrorists were relocating the hostages again, or they were preparing for some other action as their deadline approached. Martinez placed his shaped charges against the weak section of wall, using just enough explosive to create a man-sized breach without alerting the entire compound to their presence. The charges were designed to direct the blast inward, minimizing the sound signature while maximizing the structural damage to the mud brick construction. Charges set. 30 seconds to breach on your command, boss, Martinez reported through the tactical communication system. Rodriguez coordinated with both teams, ensuring everyone was in position for simultaneous entry. The plan called for Alpha 1 to breach the eastern wall, while Alpha 2 moved through a drainage culvert that accessed the northern courtyard. Thompson would provide overwatch and long-range fire support from his elevated position. All stations, this is Alpha 1. Execute in 10 seconds. Remember, positive identification on all targets. Watch for civilian clothing and female hostages. We expect at least 4 women among the captives. The explosion was muffled but effective, creating a jagged opening in the compound wall large enough for the SEALs to enter in tactical formation. Rodriguez went through first, scanning for immediate threats while Martinez and Shark followed behind him, each covering a different sector of the courtyard they had entered. The compound was larger and more complex than the satellite imagery had suggested. Traditional Afghan architecture created multiple levels, hidden courtyards, and interconnected buildings that provided excellent defensive positions, but also created numerous blind spots and potential ambush sites. Rodriguez moved along the eastern wall, using hand signals to direct his team toward the main building where intelligence suggested the majority of hostages were being held. The night vision equipment revealed details that hadn't been visible from their observation post. Prayer rugs hanging on lines, children's toys scattered in one courtyard, and cooking areas that suggested this was a family compound being used by the terrorists. Alpha 1, I've got movement in the main building. Second floor, third window from the right. Morrison's voice was barely audible through the throat mic. Appears to be a sentry position. Williams led Alpha 2 through the drainage system, which provided concealed access to the northern section of the compound, but required the SEALs to move in single file through a concrete culvert barely wide enough for a man wearing full combat equipment. Alpha 2 is in position, Williams reported as his team emerged from the drainage tunnel into a small courtyard surrounded by outbuildings. We can see into the main structure from here. Thermal shows multiple heat signatures on the ground floor. The compound's layout was proving to be more defensible than initially assessed. The terrorists had chosen their location well, with multiple buildings providing overlapping fields of fire and numerous escape routes through the complex network of courtyards and connecting passages. Rodriguez reached the main building and pressed himself against the wall beside a wooden door that appeared to be the primary entrance to the ground floor. Through the door, he could hear voices speaking in what sounded like Pashto, along with other sounds that might have been the hostages. Chen monitored the various communication frequencies, listening for any indication that the terrorists had detected the SEAL's presence. So far, the radio intercepts suggested the guards were maintaining their normal routine, unaware that their compound had been infiltrated. I'm hearing conversation about food preparation, Chen reported. Sounds like they're planning to feed the hostages. Could be a good opportunity if they're gathered in one location. Martinez moved to a window on the eastern side of the main building, carefully raising his head to peer through a gap in the wooden shutters. What he saw inside made him freeze. Approximately 8 people sitting on the floor in traditional captive positions, hands bound behind their backs with 2 armed guards standing nearby. Boss, I've got eyes on hostages. Count 8 individuals, mixed male and female, appear to be restrained. 2 guards with AK-47s positioned at opposite ends of the room. The situation was becoming clearer but more complex. The thermal imaging had been accurate about the number of people in the building, but the actual layout and guard positions were different from what they had anticipated. Rodriguez made tactical calculations in his head. 8 hostages in this building meant 4 were somewhere else in the compound. Alpha 2 would need to locate and secure the remaining captives, while Alpha 1 dealt with the guards and freed the hostages they had found. Alpha 2, we've located 8 hostages in the main building. You need to find the other 4. Check the northern structures. Williams acknowledged and led his team toward the smaller buildings where thermal imaging had detected additional heat signatures. The compound was larger than expected, with several structures they hadn't identified during the reconnaissance phase. Thompson, maintaining overwatch from his elevated position, reported additional movement around the compound perimeter. Alpha 1 Delta. I'm seeing increased activity. Looks like they might be changing guard rotations early. Could indicate they suspect something. The intelligence picture continued to evolve as the SEALs gathered more information from inside the compound. The terrorists appeared to be more organized and better prepared than initial assessments had suggested, with evidence of coordinated defensive planning and professional security measures. Rodriguez positioned his team for entry into the main building, knowing that once they breached the room containing the hostages, they would have only seconds to neutralize the guards before the terrorists could harm their captives or alert the rest of the compound. On my mark, we breach and clear. Martinez takes the guard on the left, I'll take the one on the right. Shark, you secure the hostages and get them ready for movement. Questions? The team confirmed their understanding of the plan. Years of training and combat experience had prepared them for exactly this type of situation, but the presence of civilian hostages made every decision more critical and every mistake potentially fatal. Chen continued monitoring the communications frequencies, noting an increase in radio traffic that suggested the terrorists might be conducting some type of scheduled check-in or status report with external commanders. Boss, I'm hearing more activity on their command frequency. Sounds like they're expecting some kind of communication or visit. Could be a leadership meeting or supply delivery. The timing was becoming more critical. If the terrorists were expecting visitors or conducting high-level meetings, it could indicate they were preparing to move the hostages or carry out their threats if their demands weren't met. Williams reached the northern building and carefully approached a window that would allow him to observe the interior. Through his night vision equipment, he could see additional people inside, but determining which were hostages and which were guards was challenging in the low-light conditions. Alpha 1, Alpha 2. I've got visual on the northern structure. Appears to be 4 individuals inside, but I can't confirm hostage versus guard status from this position. The tactical situation was becoming more complex as both teams discovered that the compound contained more people and more sophisticated defensive preparations than intelligence had suggested. The SEALs needed to adapt their plan while maintaining the element of surprise. Rodriguez knew that successful hostage rescue operations depended on speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower applied at precisely the right moment. Too early, and the guards could kill the hostages. Too late, and the terrorists could organize a coordinated defense or call for reinforcements. Martinez reported additional intelligence from his observation position. I can see into the room better now. The hostages appear to be in good physical condition, but they're all restrained with their hands behind their backs. The guards are positioned where they can control the entire room with their weapons. The guard positions presented both an opportunity and a challenge. While the SEALs could potentially neutralize both terrorists with well-placed shots, the risk of hitting hostages or missing in the low-light conditions was significant. Thompson continued his overwatch duties, scanning the surrounding area for threats or reinforcements while maintaining communication with both assault teams. His elevated position provided excellent visibility of the compound and surrounding terrain, but also made him vulnerable to detection if the terrorists had thermal imaging equipment. Delta to all stations. I'm seeing movement on the road leading to the compound. Looks like a vehicle approaching from the south. Range approximately 2 kilometers and closing. The approaching vehicle complicated the tactical situation significantly. If it contained reinforcements or leadership elements, the SEALs needed to complete their mission before the new arrivals could organize a defense or harm the hostages. Rodriguez made the decision to accelerate the timeline. All stations were moving to immediate execution. Alpha 2, confirm status on the northern building. We need to move simultaneously. Williams positioned his team outside the northern structure, using hand signals to coordinate their entry. Through the window, he could now see that 2 of the 4 individuals inside appeared to be bound in the same manner as the hostages in the main building. Alpha 2 ready for entry. I confirm 2 probable hostages, 2 probable guards in the northern structure. The coordination required for simultaneous entry into multiple buildings while maintaining communication and mutual support tested every aspect of the SEALs' training and experience. Each team member understood his role and the critical timing required for success. Rodriguez began his final approach to the door of the main building, knowing that within the next few minutes, 12 American lives would depend on his team's ability to execute a complex rescue operation under challenging conditions. The approaching vehicle had reached the compound's outer perimeter, its headlights visible to Thompson through his scope. The new arrivals would complicate the situation significantly. potentially turning a hostage rescue into a running firefight through unfamiliar terrain. All stations, vehicle is at the compound entrance. We need to execute now before the situation deteriorates further. Martinez readied his breaching charge for the main building door while Rodriguez and Chen prepared to follow immediately behind him. The room contained 8 American hostages and 2 armed guards, and the SEALs would have perhaps 3 seconds to assess and respond to whatever they found inside. Chen made final checks on his medical equipment, knowing that hostage rescue operations often resulted in injuries to both captives and rescuers. His job would be to provide immediate medical care to any wounded Americans, while the rest of the team secured the area and prepared for extraction. Williams counted down to simultaneous breach. Execute in 3, 2, 1. The explosive charges detonated simultaneously, creating openings in both buildings while the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder outside the compound walls. The explosions shattered the night silence as both teams breached their respective targets. Rodriguez stormed through the smoking doorway of the main building, his weapon raised and night vision scanning for threats. What he saw in that first crucial second would stay with him for the rest of his career. 8 people sat bound on the floor, just as Martinez had reported. But something was wrong with the picture. The 2 guards Martinez had identified were lying motionless near the walls, and standing in the center of the room, holding an AK-47 with practiced familiarity, was a woman in traditional Afghan clothing. She wasn't pointing the weapon at the SEALs. Instead, she held it at a low, ready position, her finger alongside the trigger guard in the universal sign of someone with professional weapons training. Her face was partially covered by a hijab, but her eyes were clearly visible in the infrared spectrum of Rodriguez's night vision, calm, alert, and unmistakably American. "Don't shoot," she said in clear, unaccented English. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. These guards are unconscious, not dead. We need to talk." Rodriguez held his position, weapon trained on the woman but finger off the trigger. Years of combat experience had taught him to process complex situations quickly, but this scenario was unlike anything in the training manuals. "Alpha 2, report status," he commanded through his throat mic while maintaining visual contact with Dr. Mitchell. Williams' voice crackled through the communication system. "Alpha 2 has secured 4 hostages, 2 guards neutralized. All Americans accounted for and in good condition." The tactical situation had changed completely in a matter of seconds. Instead of the expected firefight with terrorist guards, the SEALs found themselves facing a hostage who had apparently taken control of her own rescue. Mitchell slowly lowered the rifle, placing it on the ground and stepping away with her hands visible. "Lieutenant Commander, I assume? I'm a trauma surgeon and I've been treating wounded fighters on both sides for the past 6 days. There's something you need to know about this situation before we proceed." Rodriguez signaled Martinez and Chen to secure the other hostages while maintaining his focus on Dr. Mitchell. The bound Americans were beginning to stir, apparently awakening from some form of sedation rather than sleeping normally. "Ma'am, we're here to extract you and the other Americans. We need to move immediately. There's a vehicle approaching, and our window for safe extraction is closing rapidly." Dr. Mitchell nodded but remained in position. "Commander, I understand the urgency, but this isn't a straightforward terrorist kidnapping. These people aren't Taliban or Al-Qaeda. They're refugees who took us captive because they were desperate, not because they're ideologically motivated terrorists." Thompson's voice interrupted from his overwatch position. "Alpha 1, that vehicle has stopped at the main gate. I count 6 individuals dismounting. They're armed and moving toward the compound entrance." The tactical clock was running, but Rodriguez found himself in an unprecedented situation. A hostage who had clearly adapted to her circumstances and might have information that could affect the mission's outcome. Chen was checking the other hostages, confirming they were sedated but uninjured. "Boss, they've all been drugged, probably to keep them compliant during movement. Everyone appears physically healthy, but they'll need time to become fully alert." Martinez had secured the unconscious guards, confirming they were breathing and had been rendered unconscious by what appeared to be medical intervention rather than violence. Professional zip ties and medical monitoring equipment suggested Dr. Mitchell had used her skills to neutralize the threats without killing them. "Doctor, we have approximately 3 minutes before this situation becomes significantly more dangerous," Rodriguez said firmly. What do you need to tell me that's worth risking 12 American lives? Dr. Mitchell spoke quickly but clearly. The people holding us aren't terrorists. Their extended family group whose village was destroyed by an errant airstrike 3 weeks ago. They lost everything and were trying to reach relatives in Pakistan when they encountered our medical convoy. The sound of voices and movement outside the compound grew louder as the new arrivals approached. Thompson reported through the tactical network. New contacts are at the main entrance. Looks like they're arguing with someone inside. Could be a leadership dispute or negotiation. Rodriguez processed the information while calculating rapidly changing tactical factors. The mission briefing had identified their captors as a terrorist cell led by former Taliban commanders. But Dr. Mitchell's account suggested a completely different scenario. Ma'am, regardless of their motivations, they're holding American citizens against their will and have made demands that threaten national security. We need to extract you and the others immediately. Mitchell stepped closer, her medical training evident in how she moved to check on the other hostages, even while talking to Rodriguez. Commander, the leader, Khalil, he's not a terrorist commander. He's a school teacher, whose entire family was killed in that airstrike. He's desperate and making terrible decisions. But he's not the ideological enemy your intelligence described. Williams reported from the northern building. Alpha 1, my hostages are mobile and ready for movement. What's our extraction plan given the new contacts outside? The complexity of the situation was unprecedented in Rodriguez's experience. Intelligence failures weren't uncommon in combat operations, but discovering that the enemy might not be the enemy at all created moral and tactical dilemmas that training hadn't fully prepared him for. Chen had roused the other hostages to a level of alertness that would allow them to move under their own power. Dr. James Park, the infectious disease specialist, was the first to regain full consciousness. Sarah, what's happening? Are these soldiers here to rescue us? Dr. Park asked weakly, still affected by whatever sedative he had been given. Yes, but the situation is complicated, Dr. Square, Mitchell replied, then turned back to Rodriguez. Commander, I've been treating wounded children and elderly people in this compound for the past 4 days. These aren't hardened fighters. They're refugees who made a desperate decision when they encountered our convoy. Thompson's reports from Overwatch were becoming more urgent. Alpha 1, the new arrivals are entering the compound. I count at least 8 individuals, and they appear to be carrying heavier weapons than the guards we observed earlier. This could be actual reinforcements or leadership elements. Rodriguez faced a decision that would affect not only his team and the hostages, but potentially the broader mission and intelligence assessments that had brought them to this point. The woman standing before him had clearly adapted to her captivity in ways that suggested a complex relationship with her captors. Doctor, I need you to understand something. Whether these people are refugees or terrorists, they've created an international incident by taking American citizens hostage. There will be consequences regardless of their motivations. Mitchell nodded grimly. I understand that, Commander. But there's something else. The demands they made, they weren't really expecting them to be met. Khalil knows the American government doesn't negotiate with terrorists. He's been planning to release us, but he needed a way to save face with his people and get safe passage to Pakistan. The tactical situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. Thompson reported muzzle flashes near the main gate, suggesting the new arrivals were engaging someone, possibly compound guards or each other. All stations, we have weapons fire at the main entrance. Appears to be internal conflict among the hostiles. This could be our opportunity, or it could make extraction more dangerous. Rodriguez made his decision based on the immediate tactical requirements, regardless of the political or moral complexities Dr. Mitchell had introduced. All Americans need to move to the extraction point now. We'll sort out the intelligence failures later. Dr. Mitchell helped gather the medical supplies and personal items the hostages had been allowed to keep. Commander, there are wounded people in this compound who will die without medical attention. I've been treating them with limited supplies, but they need evacuation to proper medical facilities. The ethical dilemma was becoming more complex with each passing minute. The SEALs' mission was to rescue American hostages, but they were discovering a humanitarian crisis that extended beyond their original parameters. Martinez reported from his position covering the main entrance. Boss, the gunfire outside has stopped. Looks like one group drove off the other, but I can't tell which side won. We need to move to our extraction point before whoever's left gets organized. Rodriguez coordinated with both teams to begin moving the hostages toward the predetermined extraction point where helicopters would pick them up. The route would take them through part of the compound where Dr. Mitchell said wounded refugees were sheltering. Alpha 2, begin moving your hostages to the extraction point. Alpha 1 will follow with our group. Maintain tactical spacing and watch for remaining hostiles. As they moved through the compound, Rodriguez could see what Dr. Mitchell had described. In several of the buildings were wounded civilians, elderly men, women, and children who appeared to be suffering from injuries consistent with blast trauma and shrapnel wounds. Dr. Mitchell paused at one building where an elderly woman lay on makeshift bedding, her breathing labored and irregular. She has internal injuries from the airstrike. I've done what I can, but she needs surgery that can only be performed in a real hospital. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Rodriguez as he balanced his responsibility for the Americans under his command against the humanitarian crisis unfolding around them. The intelligence briefing had prepared him for a tactical rescue, not an ethical dilemma involving civilian casualties. Thompson continued providing overwatch, reporting the tactical situation as both SEAL teams moved through the compound with their rescued hostages. All stations, I have eyes on the extraction zone. Appears clear, but visibility is limited. Recommend moving quickly while we have the opportunity. Mitchell walked alongside Rodriguez, carrying medical supplies and continuing to provide information about the past 6 days. Commander, I need you to understand. These people didn't want to become hostage takers. They were trying to get attention for what happened to their village, but they never intended to hurt us. The extraction helicopters were approaching, their sound beginning to echo off the mountain walls surrounding the compound. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive rhythm of rotors that meant safety and successful mission completion, but the situation had become far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Chen was monitoring radio frequencies, picking up communications that suggested confusion and conflict among the various groups in the area. I'm hearing multiple factions trying to coordinate something, but the traffic is fragmented. Could be internal fighting or could be preparation for an attack on us. As the SEAL teams reached the extraction point with all 12 rescued Americans, Rodriguez realized that this mission would require extensive debriefing and intelligence analysis to understand what had actually transpired. The helicopters touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash, their crews ready to load the hostages and extraction team for the flight to safety. But as Dr. Mitchell was helped aboard the aircraft, she turned to Rodriguez one final time. Commander, I hope you'll include in your report that these people aren't the enemy we thought they were. They made terrible choices, but they were driven by desperation, not ideology. There's a difference that matters for how we respond to situations like this in the future. Rodriguez nodded as the helicopter lifted off, carrying the rescued Americans toward safety while leaving behind a compound full of wounded refugees whose story would complicate intelligence assessments and policy decisions for months to come. The mission had been tactically successful. All 12 hostages rescued without casualties to the SEAL team or the Americans they had come to save. But the discovery that their captors were desperate refugees, rather than ideological terrorists, would require a fundamental reassessment of the intelligence that had brought them to this remote Afghan compound. As the helicopters disappeared into the night sky, the compound below remained filled with wounded civilians whose fate would now depend on decisions made far from the mountain valleys where they had sought refuge from a war that had already taken everything they had.